There are moments in life that split time in half. Not loud moments. Not moments with fireworks or crowds or dramatic music playing in the background. The moments that truly change everything are quiet ones. A soft sound. A breath. A name spoken so low that only the air around it moves. And, yet somehow, that one whispered name travels across a crowded room, reaches the exact ears it was always meant to find, and breaks something open that had been locked shut for decades. This is one of those moments. This is a story about a woman named Clara. And, the name that was whispered on a cold November evening that rearranged the entire order of her life, the lives of strangers in that room, and the hearts of everyone who later heard what happened. Read this slowly. Because once you finish, you will never look at a stranger the same way again. Clara Bennett had learned very early in life that the best way to survive was to stay small. Not small in body. Small in presence. Small in expectation. Small in the amount of space she allowed herself to take up in a room, in a conversation, in someone else's life. She had learned this lesson not from a book or a teacher or a wise grandmother who sat by a fireplace and offered gentle advice. She had learned it the hard way. The kind of way that leaves marks you carry for the rest of your life even when you cannot see them in the mirror. She was 7 years old the first time she truly understood that she did not belong anywhere. It was a Tuesday. She remembered it being a Tuesday because the foster home she was living in at the time always served canned soup on Tuesdays, and the smell of it still made her stomach turn even 30 years later. The woman who ran the house, a large woman named Mrs. Draper who wore the same blue housecoat every single day, had gotten a phone call that afternoon. Clara had been sitting on the floor in the hallway, coloring in a workbook with a broken red crayon, when she heard Mrs. Draper's voice drop low the way adults' voices always did when they were talking about something they did not want children to hear. "She's a quiet one," Mrs. Draper had said into the phone. "Doesn't cause trouble. But she's got that look in her eyes. Like she's waiting for something. I don't know what. She'll probably age out if nobody comes forward." Age out. Clara had not known what those words meant that day. But something in the tone of them settled into her chest like a stone. Heavy. Cold. Permanent. She found out what it meant as she got older. It meant that the system would keep her until she turned 18, and then it would open its hands and let her fall. No family. No roots. No soft place to land. Just a door that closed behind her and a world that had no idea she existed. But Clara was stubborn in the way only people who have been overlooked can be. The kind of stubborn that does not announce itself. It does not make speeches or demand attention. It simply keeps moving. It keeps breathing. It keeps showing up even when showing up feels like the hardest thing in the world. She graduated high school with good grades and a scholarship to a state university 3 hours away from the city she had grown up in. She packed everything she owned into one single duffel bag. She did not look back when the bus pulled away. Not because she was not hurting, but because there was nothing behind her to look back at. College was the first time Clara felt like she might have a place in the world. Not because it was easy. It was not. She worked 2 jobs to cover what her scholarship did not. She ate cheap food and wore second-hand clothes and studied until her eyes burned. But there was something about being in a place where nobody knew her history that gave her room to breathe. Nobody looked at her with that particular kind of pity that she had grown so used to. Nobody tilted their head when they heard her last name and tried to remember if she was one of the foster kids from the Draper house. She was just Clara. A girl with good grades and tired eyes and a quiet laugh that surprised people when it came out. She studied education. Became a teacher. Elementary school, 3rd grade. She had known from the time she was a teenager that she wanted to work with children who felt invisible. She wanted to be the person who noticed them. The person who said their name in a room full of noise and meant it. She was good at it. Genuinely, naturally good at it. Her students loved her not because she was loud or funny or gave out candy on Fridays, though she did sometimes do that. They loved her because when she looked at them, she looked like she actually saw them. every child in her classroom knew that Miss Bennet thought they mattered. And, for some of them, some of the quiet ones who sat in the back end, colored with broken crayons and already knew what it felt like to be background noise, that knowledge was the difference between giving up and holding on. She taught for 11 years in the same school. She built a life that looked, from the outside, like everything a person could want. A small apartment with plants on the windowsill. A car that ran most of the time. A good friend named Diane who brought her soup when she was sick and made her laugh harder than anyone else ever had. A cat named George who slept at the foot of her bed and sometimes looked at her with an expression that felt oddly like unconditional love. But underneath all of it, beneath the plants and the car and the good friend and the cat, there was a question that Clara had been carrying since she was old enough to form it. A question she had never spoken aloud to another living person. Not even Diane, who knew almost everything about her. She had never stopped wondering about her mother. She knew almost nothing. Only what was in the file she had been allowed to see when she turned 18. A name that had been partially redacted. An age. A city. The single line that said relinquishment was voluntary and nothing else. No reason. No note. No explanation for why a woman had looked at a baby and decided to walk away. Clara had told herself for years that she was not angry about it. She had told herself that she understood, that life was complicated, that people made impossible choices under impossible pressure. She was good at that. At building clean, rational frameworks around things that were anything but rational. At taking pain and packaging it neatly so it did not take up too much room. But there were nights when the question came back with its full weight. Not gentle. Not neat. Raw and heavy and impossible to reason with. Why? Just that. Why? She had tried once, about 4 years earlier, to use one of those DNA ancestry websites. She had sent in her sample and waited 6 weeks and gotten back a report full of percentages and distant cousin matches and a map of places her ancestors had lived. She had gone through every single match. Written to several of them. Most did not reply. The ones who did were polite and distant and had no information that helped her find what she was looking for. She had put the folder in a drawer and tried to forget about it. She had almost succeeded. The evening of November 14th began like any ordinary Thursday. Clara had stayed late at school to set up a display of her students' writing projects on the hallway bulletin board. She had stopped at the grocery store on the way home. She had fed George and changed into her most comfortable sweater and was fully prepared to spend the rest of the night on the couch with a book. But Diane had called at 6:30 with the particular tone she used when she had already decided something and was presenting it as a question as a formality. "There's a community event at the library tonight," Diane said. "A storytelling evening. Local people sharing personal stories. I know you're tired. I know you're going to say no. I'm coming to pick you up in 45 minutes. Clara had said no 3 times in the span of 2 minutes. Diane had responded to all 3 by telling her what she was planning to wear and asking what Clara was planning to bring for the potluck portion of the evening. At 7:15, Clara was in Diane's passenger seat, holding a tin of brownies she had somehow made in 35 minutes, wearing her good blue coat and a look on her face that Diane cheerfully ignored. The library was a beautiful old building on the edge of downtown, the kind with high ceilings and wooden floors that creaked in a way that felt friendly rather than ominous. The event was held in the large reading room on the main floor. Someone had arranged chairs in a wide semicircle around a small microphone stand. There were candles on the tables along the walls, real ones in glass holders, and the room had the warm, golden quality of a place that was happy to be full of people. Clara guessed there were about 80 people there. Maybe more. All ages, all types. She recognized a few faces from the neighborhood. A man she sometimes saw walking a very large dog. A woman who worked at the dry cleaners 3 blocks from her apartment. She did not know their names, but she knew their faces, the way you know the faces of people who exist in the background of your daily life without ever becoming part of it. She and Diane found 2 seats together near the middle of the semicircle. The brownies went on the potluck table. Clara wrapped both hands around a cup of cider someone handed her and settled in, already privately calculating how long it would be before she could politely suggest they leave. The event began. A man named Robert, who appeared to be in his late 60s, stood at the microphone and welcomed everyone. He explained that the evening was part of a series meant to bring the community together through personal stories. No rules about what to share. Only one guideline: be honest. The first storyteller was a teenage boy who talked about learning to swim at 15 when everyone around him had known how since they were 5. He was nervous and his voice shook, but the room listened to every word. The second was a woman in her 40s who talked about leaving a job she had worked for 20 years to start over with nothing but a savings account and a sketchbook. She was funny and self-deprecating, and the room laughed with her in the warm way of people who recognized something of themselves in her words. Clara began to relax. She stopped thinking about when they were leaving. She drank her cider. She listened. The fourth storyteller was an older woman who came to the microphone slowly, with the careful movement of someone whose body required more negotiation than it used to. She looked to be in her late 60s, maybe early 70s. White hair pulled back. A green cardigan. Small gold earrings. She stood at the microphone for a moment before speaking, and in that moment she looked out at the room with an expression that Clara noticed but could not quite name. Something between courage and terror. Something that looked like a person standing at the edge of something they had been approaching for a very long time. The woman's name, she said, was Margaret. And she had come tonight, she said, because she had a story she needed to tell before she ran out of time to tell it. The room settled into a particular kind of quiet. The kind that only happens when a crowd of strangers collectively senses that something real is about to be said. Margaret gripped the sides of the microphone stand with both hands. She took a breath. 40 years ago, she said, I made a decision that I have never fully recovered from. Clara's cup was halfway to her lips. She set it down slowly on the armrest of her chair. I was 23 years old. I was alone in a way that most people around me had no idea about. And I did something that I told myself was the right thing. That it was the only thing. That the child I was giving up would have a better life than I could give her. She paused. I have spent 40 years trying to believe that. Some days I almost do. The room was absolutely still. I don't know if she's out there, Margaret said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. I don't know if she'd ever want to hear from me. I don't even know if she stopped. Pressed her lips together. Started again. I looked for her. I want that known. I want it said out loud, in front of people, because I spent too long keeping it silent. I looked for her. I never stopped looking. Clara felt something shift in her chest. A pressure. A pulling. Something that had no name she could find in any language she knew. Her name, Margaret said, very quietly, was Clara. And she did not say it loudly. She said it the way you say something that is almost too precious to survive being spoken. She said it like a whisper that had been waiting 40 years to be released. But the room was so quiet. Everyone heard it. And Clara, who had spent her entire life learning to stay small, to take up no space, to not expect anything, felt the word land in the center of her chest like a hand pressed flat against her heart. The brownies were still on the table. George was at home waiting to be fed. Diane was sitting 2 inches to her left. The world did not pause. It did not hold its breath. And, yet somehow, in that golden-lit room full of strangers, with candles flickering on the tables and the old wooden floors creaking softly under shifting weight, everything had changed. Everything. Clara did not move. That was the first thing. She simply did not move. Her hands were folded in her lap and she kept them there because moving felt like something that would cost her more than she currently had. The cider cup sat on the armrest where she had placed it. The room around her continued to exist. She could hear the smallest sounds, a chair scraping, someone clearing their throat, the quiet hum of the building's heating system, and yet all of it was arriving from somewhere far away, as though she were hearing the world through water. Diane had gone completely still beside her. Diane, who was never still. Diane, who talked through movies and tapped her fingers on tabletops and laughed too loud in quiet restaurants and somehow made all of it feel like a gift rather than an interruption. Diane had turned into a statue in the chair to Clara's left. Clara could feel it without looking. She could feel the weight of Diane holding herself back, containing something enormous, waiting. Up at the microphone, Margaret was still speaking. She was talking about the years after. About the way guilt becomes part of your body when you carry it long enough, settles into your muscles and your bones until you can't quite remember what it felt like before it was there. She talked about the therapy she had gone to in her 30s when the guilt had started making it hard to get out of bed in the mornings. She talked about the support group she had found, other women who had relinquished children and were trying to find ways to live with themselves. She talked about the first time she had searched the adoption registry and found nothing. The second time, 5 years later. The third. The quiet, persistent, painful rhythm of looking and not finding and looking again. Her voice was controlled. She was not crying. Clara could see from where she sat that Margaret was working very hard not to cry. There was something in the set of her jaw, the particular stillness of it, that looked like a person who had made a deal with themselves before they came to this microphone. You can say the words. You cannot fall apart. Not here. Not in front of these people. Hold it together long enough to say the truth out loud, and then you can fall apart later in private. Clara knew that deal. She had made it herself more times than she could count. The rest of the room was in the grip of something. Clara could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the rain actually starts. That particular heaviness in the air. Several people had their hands pressed to their mouths. An older man 2 rows over had taken his glasses off and was turning them over in his hands the way people do when they need something to hold. A young woman in the back row had her head bowed as though she were listening to something sacred. None of them knew. None of them could have known that the woman they were all so moved by was not simply sharing a story of grief and regret. That she was not just a mother who had lost a child in the abstract, permanent way of someone who would never have an answer. They did not know that the name Margaret had whispered into that golden room was sitting right there in the audience. That Clara was 17 rows back and 5 seats from the left aisle and that her hands were folded in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. Diane knew. Diane, who had been Clara's best friend for 9 years and knew almost everything about her, had known as soon as the name was spoken. Clara had told her once, over wine and takeout on a rainy Sunday, about the ancestry search. About the file she had seen at 18. About the name that had been partially redacted but not enough to hide that it started with M. About the city. About the single line that said relinquishment was voluntary. Clara had never said all of it out loud before that night. She had said it quickly, in the low voice of someone releasing something they usually kept locked up, and then she had changed the subject and Diane had let her because that was the kind of friend Diane was. She knew when to follow and when to let something be. But Diane had remembered every word. She was remembering it now. She reached over very slowly and placed her hand over Clara's clasped ones. She did not squeeze. She did not say anything. She just put her hand there and left it, warm and certain and completely steady, and Clara felt tears arrive at the backs of her eyes without warning. She blinked. Hard. Once, twice. Margaret had reached the end of her story. She said that she had come tonight not knowing whether this was the right thing or a foolish thing or a desperate thing. Maybe all three. She said she had written the name down on a piece of paper and carried it in her wallet for almost 40 years and she did not know why she felt the need to say that, only that it felt important. That it should be known that the name had never been put away. Never filed. Never forgotten. I don't expect anything, Margaret said. I'm not standing up here asking for forgiveness or a second chance or a miracle. I just needed somewhere to put this. Before I couldn't anymore. She stepped back from the microphone. She returned to her chair in the front row. The room exhaled. And then, the applause came. Not polite applause. Not the automatic, obligatory kind that fills silence after someone has finished speaking at an event. This was the real kind. The kind that has weight to it. Several people stood. Not all at once, but in a ripple, one and then another and then a handful more until most of the room was on its feet, and the sound of it filled the old library reading room and made the candle flames shiver. Clara did not stand. She could not. She sat very still and watched Margaret in the front row receiving the response of the room with the rigid, careful grace of someone who was trying very hard to hold themselves together. An older woman beside Margaret had put her arm around her. Margaret was looking at the floor. Clara's mind was doing something she had never experienced before. It was not racing. It was not frozen. It was doing something in between, moving very slowly through possibilities, through questions, through the geometry of what had just happened and what it meant and what, if anything, she was supposed to do with it. The name was not an uncommon one. There were Claras everywhere. There were probably other Claras in this room right now, statistically speaking, depending on the ages of people present. There was absolutely no concrete reason to believe that the Clara Margaret had whispered into the microphone was her. Except the city Margaret had mentioned growing up in. The one she had been living in at 23. It was the same city that appeared in Clara's file. The same city she had been born in before being moved to the foster system. Except the age. If Margaret was in her late 60s or early 70s, and she had been 23 when she gave up a child, that child would be in their mid to late 40s now. Clara had turned 46 in September. Except the way the name had sounded when Margaret said it. Clara had heard her own name spoken thousands of times by thousands of people. She had heard it called across classrooms and parking lots and over the phone and in the bright fluorescent light of school hallways. She knew every version of how it sounded. The brisk version. The affectionate version. The distracted version. She had never heard it sound like that before. Like grief. Like love. Like both at the same time, inseparable, wound together so tightly they had become a single thing. She became aware that the event was continuing. A new storyteller had taken the microphone, a young man talking about his first year in the country after immigrating from somewhere Clara could not focus enough to register. His voice was animated and warm and the room was following him. Life was going on, as it always did, indifferent to the private earthquakes happening inside individual people seated in its midst. Clara. Diane's voice was barely above a breath. It was not a question. It was not an instruction. It was just her name, spoken carefully, the way you speak to someone who was standing very close to an edge. I know, Clara said. What do you want to do? The question was so simple. 5 words. And Clara had absolutely no idea how to answer it. What she wanted, in the most honest and unguarded part of herself, was to walk out of the room. To go home, to her apartment, to George waiting at the door, to the familiar weight of her routines and the comfortable distance she had maintained from this particular pain for her entire adult life. She was good at distance. She had built her life with it, used it as both foundation and shelter. Distance was safe. Distance did not leave you standing in the middle of a community library with your hands gone pale in your lap and your whole chest feeling like it had been split down the middle. But there was another part of her. The part that had sent in the DNA test. The part that had written to distant cousin matches and waited for replies that mostly never came. The part that had kept the folder in the drawer instead of throwing it away. The part that had spent 39 years carrying a question that she had never once, not even in her most determined moments, fully released. Why? Just that. Why? The event was winding toward its halfway point. The host, Robert, announced a short break for refreshments. The formal semicircle of chairs dissolved into small clusters of people moving and talking and gravitating toward the potluck table. The noise level rose back to something ordinary and social. Margaret was still in the front of the room. She had accepted a cup of something from the woman beside her and was holding it in both hands with the look of someone who had just done something enormous and was now sitting in the aftermath of it, a little dazed, a little lighter, a little uncertain of what came next. Clara stood up. She was not fully aware of the decision until she was already upright. Her legs carried her forward. The room was full of movement and conversation, and she moved through it the way you move through a crowd when you have fixed on a point at the other end and everything between you and it becomes peripheral. Diane stood too, a step behind and to the left, close enough to be there if needed and far enough to give her room. Clara was 10 feet away when Margaret looked up. It was the kind of moment that you cannot plan for and cannot adequately describe after the fact because the language for it does not fully exist. Two people in a crowded room. One standing still. One moving toward her. And something in the space between them shifting in a way that had no name but that both of them felt at exactly the same moment. Margaret went very still. Her eyes found Clara's face and stayed there, and the cup she was holding tilted slightly in her grip, and the woman beside her reached out a steadying hand without knowing why. Clara stopped 3 feet away. She had planned, in the 10 steps it had taken her to cross the room, to say something measured. Something that acknowledged the possibility without committing to it. Something that created space without demanding anything. She was a teacher. She was good with words. She knew how to introduce a difficult conversation gently. But she was also a woman who had spent her whole life staying small, and she was standing in front of someone whose hands were shaking, whose eyes had gone wide with something that looked terrifyingly close to recognition, and all her measured sentences dissolved. She said only, "You said the name Clara." And her voice came out steady. She did not know how. But it came out steady. Margaret set the cup down on the table beside her very carefully. As though it were fragile. As though everything in the immediate vicinity had suddenly become fragile. "Yes," Margaret said. Her voice was a whisper again. "I did. I was born in October. 46 years ago." Clara paused. "In St. Francis Hospital." In Millhaven, Margaret finished. The word dropped into the air between them like something that had been falling for a very long time and had finally reached the ground. Clara felt Diane's hand come to rest on her shoulder blade. Warm. Steady. A single point of solid ground in a room that had started to feel like water. Margaret's face had done something extraordinary. All the careful control she had maintained through her story, through the applause, through the social landscape of the break, all of it had left in a single second. What remained was raw and enormous and almost too much to look at directly. She pressed one hand flat over her mouth. Her eyes did not leave Clara's face. Around them, people moved and talked and reached for food and laughed at small things. The ordinary business of a Thursday evening continued without interruption. No one nearby had noticed yet. The world had not paused. The candles still burned. The floors still creaked. But, in the small, still circle of space between these two women, 46 years had just collapsed into a single moment. And neither of them had any idea yet what it would take to build something in the wreckage. Or whether they even could. Or whether what existed between them was something that could be built at all, or only acknowledged, named, witnessed, held carefully like something too delicate for permanent structures. All Clara knew, standing there in her good blue coat in the golden light of the library reading room, was that she had come tonight because Diane had not taken no for an answer. And that her name, had been carried in a wallet for 40 years by a woman who was standing 3 feet away from her and could not stop shaking. And that some part of her, deep and stubborn and entirely unwilling to stay small any longer, had already known from the moment the whisper landed that she was not going to walk out of this room unchanged. She had never in her life been more terrified. She had never in her life been more certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound. It is the silence that lives between two people when the words they are trying to say are so large that ordinary language keeps breaking under the weight of them. The room around Clara and Margaret was full of noise, laughter, conversations, the sound of plates being lifted from the potluck table, someone asking if there was decaf, but between these two women, standing 3 feet apart in the golden light of the library reading room, there was that other kind of silence. The kind that holds its breath. Margaret moved first. She did not lunge. She did not reach. She simply took one small step forward, very slow, very careful, in the way of someone who has been burned before by moving too fast towards something she wanted. And that one step, that careful and terrified and hopeful single step, was what finally broke something open in Clara's chest that she had been keeping sealed for 46 years. She had told herself for a long time that she did not need this. That she had built a life that was full enough and good enough and real enough without it. She had her students, her apartment, her plants on the windowsill, her cat, her friendship with Diane, which was the truest and best relationship she had ever had. She had made something from nothing, which was the only thing she had ever been given to work with, and she was proud of it. She had not spent her adult years in the active grip of longing. She had not walked around wounded. She had functioned. She had thrived, even, by most measures. But the human heart does not run on most measures. It runs on the specific. The irreplaceable. The things that cannot be substituted or rebuilt from alternative materials no matter how skilled or determined you are. And the specific thing Clara had gone without since she was 6 days old was standing in front of her with shaking hands and eyes that had not looked away from her face for a single second. "I have to ask you something," Clara said. Her voice was still steady. She was still, somewhere beneath the earthquake, a woman who had learned to hold herself together. Margaret nodded. One quick, tight nod. "Whatever it is. Ask it. I'll answer it." "Did you ever?" Clara stopped. Started over. "Were you ever going to look again? Before tonight? Before this?" Margaret let out a long, slow breath. "I was diagnosed in March," she said quietly. "Breast cancer. They think we caught it. They think I'll be okay. But it was the kind of thing that makes you stop pretending you have more time than you do." She paused. "I had been sitting with the idea of coming to something like this for 2 years. March was when I finally ran out of reasons not to." Clara absorbed this. March to November. 8 months of gathering the courage to walk to a microphone and say a name into a room full of strangers and hope that somewhere, somehow, the universe was paying attention. "I'm a third-grade teacher," Clara said. She did not know why she said that first. Of everything she could have said, "I'm 46 years old, I have a cat, I spent 11 Christmases in houses where no one was waiting for me to come home," she said that. Maybe because it was the thing she was most proud of. Maybe because she wanted Margaret to know, immediately, without any kind of softening, that whatever had happened when Clara was 6 days old had not destroyed her. That she had made something. That she was someone. Margaret's face did something complicated. Something that was grief and relief and wonder all folded together into a single expression. "Are you?" she said softly. Not a question, really. More like a response to something she could not quite put into words. "Third grade," Clara said again. "I have 22 students. I've been doing it for 11 years. Do you love it?" "Every single day." Margaret pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. She was going to be a teacher, she said. And then, she shook her head slightly. "I used to think that. When I thought about her growing up. I used to imagine," she stopped. "I'm sorry. I know you're not, I should say you." "Not she." "It's okay," Clara said. And then, very quietly, because something in her had shifted and she was no longer trying to manage this conversation from a safe distance, she said, "What did you think I would be like?" Something in Margaret's face opened up completely. She described it carefully. The version of Clara she had built in her head over 4 decades of not knowing. She had imagined a girl who read a lot. Who was maybe a little stubborn, a little private, the kind of child who made friends slowly but kept them for life. She had imagined someone who was good at noticing things that other people missed. Who laughed when something genuinely struck her as funny, not as a social reflex. Who was more comfortable in small groups than large ones. Who preferred quiet evenings to loud ones but could hold her own in a crowd when she chose to. Clara had gone still in a new way. She was listening to a woman describe her. Describe her accurately. Describe her as though she had been watching from somewhere without being seen. How did you know? Clara asked. Margaret blinked. Know what? All of that. The reading. All of it. How did you know? Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice had dropped to something very soft. I didn't know, she said. I just hoped. I suppose I spent 40 years hoping she would turn out to be someone I would recognize. The word recognize hung in the air between them. Clara felt Diane step slightly away behind her, not leaving, never leaving, just giving them a pocket of privacy that she had realized they needed. It was exactly the right thing to do at exactly the right moment, which was Diane in her entirety. Around them, the library continued its evening. The second half of the storytelling event was beginning to reassemble. Robert was at the front of the room making gentle gestures that suggested people should start returning to their seats. The cluster of noise was shifting back toward organized attention. Clara looked at the chairs being reclaimed, the event resuming its shape, and, then, she looked back at Margaret. Can we go somewhere? She asked. Somewhere quieter. Margaret answered immediately, without hesitation, the way someone answers when they have been waiting for a question for 40 years. Yes, she said. Yes. Wherever you want. They found a small seating area near the library's back entrance, a corner with 2 low armchairs and a side table with a lamp on it that gave off a warm, amber light. It felt, in its quiet and its smallness, like the opposite of a stage. Like a place where nothing had to be performed. They sat. Diane settled herself at a respectful distance on a bench near the door, close enough to be present, far enough to be invisible. She had brought her coffee and her phone, and she stared at both of them with the focused nonchalance of a woman who was absolutely listening to every word and completely pretending she was not. What happened in that corner for the next 2 hours was not one conversation. It was many conversations, layered and overlapping and sometimes circling back on themselves. It was Clara asking about the city, about the hospital, about what Margaret remembered of the 6 days she had had. It was Margaret answering every question without flinching, without editing, without asking first whether Clara could handle the answer. It was both of them slowly, carefully, beginning to understand the shape of what had happened and what had been lost and what had been, against every probability, found. Margaret told her about being 23 and alone in a way that she had never fully told anyone, not her therapist, not her support group, not the older woman in the library who had put her arm around her tonight. She told her about a relationship that had ended badly and early and left her with nothing to work with. She told her about a family that had given her a clear and unmistakable choice: give the baby up or lose us. She told it without self-pity and without excuse-making, in the flat, factual tone of someone who has examined a thing from every possible angle for so long that they have exhausted both the defense of it and the condemnation. Clara listened. She had come in ready to hold her ground, to keep her distance, to protect herself the way she had been protecting herself since she was 7 years old, sitting in a hallway with a broken crayon. But the thing about protection is that it stops being useful the moment you realize the danger you were guarding against is not what you thought it was. She had been afraid, without fully articulating it even to herself, that the answer would be simple. That the reason would be something careless. Something that confirmed the thing she had always half believed, that she had not been worth the effort of being kept. But, sitting across from Margaret in the amber lamplight of a library back corner, listening to a woman who had carried her name in a wallet for 40 years, who had looked 3 times at an adoption registry, who had gotten a cancer diagnosis in March and decided that running out of time was not something she was willing to do quietly, Clara understood that the answer was not simple. It never had been. She had just needed someone to say it out loud, in full, in her presence, without softening it into something manageable. It still hurt. She wanted that to be clear, even if only to herself. It hurt to hear. It hurt to sit with. She was not going to go home and feel healed in the clean, complete way that stories sometimes suggest is possible. She was going to go home and probably lie awake for a long time and feel the enormity of this in all its complicated and contradictory weight. But underneath the hurt there was something else. Something she had not expected and could not have predicted. Relief. Not because she now had a mother. She did not know yet what Margaret would be to her or what she would be to Margaret, or whether the geography of their separate lives could accommodate something new being built between them. Those were questions for later, for conversations that had not happened yet, for the slow and uncertain work of figuring out who you are to someone you have only just met and, yet have always, in some fundamental way, known. The relief was simpler than that. More basic. It was the relief of a question answered. Of a door opened. Of 46 years of wondering finally, having somewhere to land. Margaret had asked, near the end of that first long conversation, what Clara remembered of growing up. And Clara had told her. She had told it as honestly as Margaret had told her own story, without the protective softening she usually applied to her past when she spoke of it to people who had not been through similar things. She told her about the Tuesday soup. About the phrase age out. About the duffel bag and the scholarship bus and the 2 jobs in college and the 11 years of 3rd grade and the 22 students and the plants on the windowsill and George the cat. Margaret had listened with the complete, full-body attention of someone who had been waiting to hear this for 40 years. When Clara finished, Margaret said, "You're extraordinary." Clara started to deflect. It was her instinct. It was what she did. She opened her mouth to say something modest and reductive. And then, she stopped herself. She sat with the word. She let it exist in the space between them without immediately clearing it away. "I had to be," she said finally. And it was not a complaint. It was just the truth. "I know," Margaret said. "I know you did." The library was beginning to close around them. They could hear the gentle sounds of the evening ending, chairs being folded, lights dimming in other rooms, Robert's voice somewhere in the distance saying thank you to the remaining guests. Diane appeared at a careful distance with Clara's coat over her arm and the specific expression of a woman who had been sitting on a bench for 2 hours and had no complaints about it whatsoever. Clara and Margaret stood at the same moment. There was another silence then. The kind that comes at the end of something, when 2 people know that whatever they do next will set a shape for what follows, and neither wants to move carelessly. Margaret spoke first. "I don't want to assume anything," she said. I know this is a lot. And I know you probably need time. I want you to know that I'm not asking for anything except," she paused. "Except maybe the chance to ask, sometime, whether you'd be willing to have a cup of coffee. Not to fix anything. Not to start over. Just to talk." Clara looked at her for a long moment. She thought about a 7-year-old girl sitting in a hallway with a broken crayon, already understanding without the words for it that she was not expected. She thought about the duffel bag. The ancestry test. The folder in the drawer. The 46 years of a question being carried around like something too heavy for one person and too important to put down. She thought about 22 children who came to her classroom every morning knowing that Miss Bennet saw them. That they were not background noise. That they mattered. She had learned to give that to others. She had never fully learned to give it to herself. "Coffee," Clara said. "Yes. I'd like that." Margaret's face did the thing again. The grief and the relief and the wonder, all at once, all together, completely undisguisable. She pressed her lips together very tightly for just a moment. And then, she nodded. Small and firm and real. They exchanged phone numbers. They put on their coats. They walked out of the library together and paused on the stone steps where the cold November air hit them both at once, sharp and clean and smelling of the first edge of winter. Diane, who had been impeccably quiet for longer than Clara had ever seen her manage in 9 years of friendship, finally said, very softly, "I'm glad you made those brownies." Clara laughed. It came out startled and genuine and a little wet around the edges. Margaret looked at her when she laughed and something in the older woman's face went completely soft. They said good night on the steps. Margaret's friend, the woman who had sat beside her, who had known where the event was and had driven her here and was now waiting beside a car in the parking lot, gave Clara a small nod as she passed, the kind of nod that contains a whole sentence. "I've heard about her for a long time." I'm glad she's real. Clara stood on the steps and watched Margaret walk to the car. Margaret turned once, at the edge of the lot, and they looked at each other across the cold dark air for just a second. Then, the car door opened and she got in and the lights came on and the car moved away. Diane stood beside Clara and neither of them spoke for a while. The name on a piece of paper in a wallet for 40 years. A microphone and a room full of strangers and the particular courage it takes to say the truth out loud when you are not sure anyone is listening and even less sure you deserve to be heard. A woman in a good blue coat in the 17th row who had spent her whole life learning to take up no space, hearing her name spoken like something precious and fragile and impossible to let go of. One name. Whispered into a warm room. And everything, quietly, permanently, irrevocably, changed. Clara walked to Diane's car. She got in. She put her seatbelt on. She looked straight ahead at the street in front of them, lit by the yellow glow of the street lamps, and she breathed. In. Out. In again. She was still the same woman who had made brownies in 35 minutes and worn her good blue coat and not wanted to come tonight. She would still go home to her apartment and feed George and take off her shoes and put the kettle on. She would still wake up tomorrow and face 22 8-year-olds who needed someone to say their names in a room full of noise and mean it. But she was also, for the first time in 46 years, a woman who knew the answer. And that quiet, enormous, whispered thing was enough to change the entire shape of everything that came next.